Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good evening, Team Krulak community. The Krulak Center is proud to offer this special episode of the Brewcast. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. In this special episode, we had the unique opportunity to talk to Dr. Hanna Shelest. She is Director of Security Programs for the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism, and Editor-in-Chief of Ukraine Analytica, which is the first Ukrainian academic and analytical journal in the English language on international relations, politics, and economics. She recently returned to Ukraine from extensive travel across that country and throughout Europe, and we are extremely grateful to her for taking the time to talk with us. We would also like to thank Dr. Amin Tarzi, Director of Middle East Studies at the Krulak Center and Marine Corps University, for helping make this episode possible. As always, all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government.
And it seems to me that on the one hand, Ukraine is daily in the news of all countries as much as possible with the different aspects, one day good news, one day bad news. But there are still certain lacunae in the perceptions and information that is coming from here. And I would like to start from the big issues and then coming to some local issues that are less public possible, or at least as for now got less attention from the international media. So we know more about these, that it is going further. First is definitely a few of the misperceptions that we still have about the Russian invasion and this Russian-Ukrainian war. A lot of experts and politicians during my trip, both in Europe and in North America, are afraid of being involved in the war. And each time they are saying that we are doing as much as possible that's be just the Russian-Ukrainian war, so not to have the spillover effect. The problem is that you cannot say that it is just a Ukrainian war. First of all, it is in general not Ukrainian war, it is the Russian invasion, because we were not the initiator or even the contradicting party before everything started. But at the same time, from the very first day when Ukraine received a substantial amount of the foreign weapons, as soon as foreign countries started to train our soldiers and officers, that already started to be not only our war. And the question is that you don't have boots on the ground doesn't make you out like a neutral or impartial party to this conflict. When the Western countries, and not only Western countries, and that is important to emphasize, the countries like Japan, for example, are issuing sanctions against the Russian Federation of that substantial amount of sanctions, you're already stopping to be just the impartial neutral party to this conflict. When you provide not only humanitarian aid, but the military aid, intelligence assistance, you are already party to the conflict. Even more, what is important to understand that you can hide as the kid, saying that if you don't see something, you are not involved. But if Russia sees you as the enemy and considers that they are fighting against NATO already, you cannot say that you are not party to this conflict, because another party, your counterpart is considering you as the party, and the Russia is building their strategy and their propaganda, looking at this situation as it is not just Russian-Ukrainian war, but Russia against the collective West. And for the last months, I would say that we have more and more evidences for this. The issue is that for the Russian Federation, it's very difficult to acknowledge that they are losing to Ukrainian armed forces. Because they always portray that Ukrainian armed forces as something weak, as the state being failed state, and they are the second biggest mighty army in the world. The situation on the ground demonstrated absolutely opposite situation. So now when you follow the Russian military bloggers, journalists, politicians, what they're saying, they are losing around Kharkiv because they've been fighting against the NATO forces. They are losing now in Kherson because they were Polish and African. And that is really interesting because they also included a lot of the racist statements. Usually it is Polish and Negro. And that is really funny. I mean, in this way, how they perceive not three categories: Anglo-Saxons, it's some crazy mix of Americans and British. It is Polish, and it is always the concentration on the black. I don't know where they found it, but probably they created certain myths that just put inside of their domestic propaganda. To these three categories of the soldiers, they are losing the war and the battles, but not to the Ukrainian armed forces. So that's why the first misperception that probably we should stop to promote is saying that it is just the Ukrainian business and others are supporting us, helping us. As soon as our partners understand that they are already party to this war, they're the side to this conflict, the assistance that they provide to Ukraine will be much more substantial and understandable. Because we still have these issues, they're developing, but they're still on the ground, that in the diplomatic corridors, should we give the long-range missiles to Ukraine or not? Should we give tanks? Should we give jets? Should we give other heavy equipment to Ukraine? And there are usually two types of questions. Question number one is, are Ukrainians capable to operate this equipment? And as 9 months of the war demonstrated that Ukrainian soldiers are very quick in learning how to use it. One of the reasons is because most of them have very good engineer background, so that's easier for them to understand how these systems operate. And the second issue is that we understand that we don't have months and years for training. We need to use it now. So you really put all your efforts and energy to learn how to do it. But the second restriction or constraint that I usually hear, especially in Washington, is we're afraid it will be used against the Russian Federation at their territory, so not to escalate the war. And here, honestly, this fear of escalation is always something very, very difficult for me to oppose because what can be bigger escalation than the elimination of Mariupol? What can be bigger than the deconstruction of the whole cities or all these mass graves that you have? So if you're afraid that Ukraine will target some of the goals, some of the aims at the territory of the Russian Federation, we don't need the long-range missiles for this. You're coming to the Russian-Ukrainian border, you are throwing the grenade, you already targeted the Russian territory. So this argument is becoming quite odd when you understand the operational necessity on the ground. So when Ukraine is asking not 80 kilometers, but 300 kilometers, that is more to secure the civilian residential areas, to secure our soldiers on the ground, and to reach those stockpiles and ammunition depots that we need from, or the aerodromes where the Russian jets are, from where the attacks against Ukraine are happening. The third issue that I would like to point out going on the ground, that's definitely understanding what is the current Russian tactic. Because we've just spoke that Russians are losing on the ground and they cannot appreciate it or still acknowledge it, they totally moved to the terroristic tactics. And as for now, we are not in the norms of war. We are not in the classical warfare. Russia as a state are acting just as a terrorist organizations. If you open the textbooks about what is terrorism, using of the fear and violence to reach your political goals and targeting civilians to influence the politicians, when Russians are throwing 100 missiles per one attack against different cities of Ukraine, destructing only civilian infrastructure of electricity, heating system, and water supply, that's not a warfare. That is the terrorist act, because that is against the conventions, that is against the humanitarian law, that is against the logic. And even if they explain it that electrical grids, for example, or transformation complexes, they're used by the military, that's definitely one of those lies that the world is not believing anymore, because perfectly understanding when the whole city, like my city of Odessa, being for 5 days without electricity, more than 1 million people, it's not the some military infrastructure that they targeted. So definitely this, but why it is done, and that is very important lessons for many armed forces and the governments around the globe. First is to bring a general fear and the additional problems to the government, but that is the easy goals. The second is they understand that population of Ukraine are really resistant and supporting Ukrainian government, not from the political party point of view, but in terms of the goals in the war and supporting the armed forces. But as soon as the population starts to struggle, it's becoming easier to manipulate with them. And what we noticed as experts that in pro-Russian social networks, some different groups, they started actively to promote the panicking moods with even the leaflets and instructions how to request from the Kiev government that they need to stop the war or they need to negotiate with Russians because we are without electricity. So that is the classical hybrid warfare in this case. You use the military to spoil the situation, then you use information operation to change the minds of the people and to have the accumulation of the efforts combining in terms of breaking the connection and ties between the armed forces, government, and population, the popular support of what is happening on the ground. That is really important in these cases. So these terroristic acts are really working, unfortunately, and it is a huge challenge now for us as experts, for media, for politicians, how not to allow the Russian Federation to continue these tactics at all levels. And the last but not the least issue about which I probably would like to speak, it is the resistance movement, because we don't speak a lot about it. And sometimes that is the problem, because a lot of people outside of Ukraine think, okay, that probably at the occupied territories, people are just calm and they're afraid, they're waiting for liberation. Or the occupied territories like Crimea, people already been for 9 years with the Russian Federation. Maybe they're not eager to return back. They don't care about this. What is happening now, and you can hear it more and more in international media, that it is extremely effective grassroots movement at all the occupied territories. Some of them are not formalized, that is individual cases. Some of them are really now as the movement, like Yellow Ribbon movement, for example, who yesterday received the Sakharov Prize in European Parliament. They are doing all these non-violent resistance, from leaflets to delivering information, spreading information. And that brings understanding for the Russians that they are not welcome. It brings feeling to the local population that somebody is fighting for them, even from inside. And that brings support to the Ukrainian armed forces before they are coming, because these people are trying to provide information important for the military intelligence. And what really struck us that originally this, for example, if we go with the Yellow Ribbon movement, they started in Kherson. They were just few IT guys who wanted to do something what they can do the best. And that's like, okay, we can do it. They started. Then through the chat boards, through different social media, they managed to gather up to 20. First, it was the 2,000 of the active supporters. And then they started to see how more and more people at the occupied territories are just doing it without any coordination, spreading their symbols, spreading their leaflets. And for the last months, we started to see that people in Crimea started to paint this yellow ribbon, started to print their leaflets and put it even in Crimea with all that repressive security services that are there. And but they demonstrate that Crimea is Ukraine. Crimea would like to return home. So it seems to me that the resistance movement is something that we are reopening now from the warfare point of view. Yeah, we all studied it during the Second World War, for example, or something was happening in Asia in 1960s. Now we are reopening how the resistance movement can be effective, helpful, integrated in times of digital technologies, in times of the different communication support that we can provide on the ground.
Oh, great, Dr. Shelest. Thank you very much for that overview of those, both the misperceptions and things to look at. I got a bunch of notes here, but I think the first thing I'd like to add on to that is ask you. I know from your own correspondence and from Dr. Tarzi that you have traveled extensively, especially recently, in and across Europe, but also in and around Ukraine. I wonder if you could share some of the places
within Ukraine that you've gone to visit recently, and sort of tell us, what you've seen, both in terms of the situation for the civilian population, as well as maybe what you've seen in terms of the performance and the status of I mean, not the operational status, but just sort of the morale, the readiness of the Ukrainian armed forces in those areas.
The situation is definitely quite different depending on the regions, and it depends on the immediate threat to the regions. And here it's not just division between the East and West, because on the East there are main battles happening now. It's a little bit more diverse, because for the last 2 months the Russians been shelling intensively with the Iranian drones and with the long-range missiles parts all around the territory of Ukraine. So that's always the situation, how close you to the, for example, big electrical stations that can be more dangerous, and the perceptions of these. The Western Ukraine have certain particularities because they accepted the biggest amount of the internally displaced people. So you have the certain developments because of this. But in general, if you go like easily dividing Ukraine for 5 parts, the north is recovering after the initial spring occupation. And that is definitely an important process of reconstruction happening there. It's still in some villages very difficult for people to return back because the towns are having the scars from the spring campaign. At the same time, you see the efforts of the civil society, of the volunteers to restore a normal well-being. But Russians are continuing shelling, so you cannot say that because they left physically those territories became absolutely safe. So because they're bordering with Belarus, with Russia, it is a constant threat of the second attack or of the shelling of the short-range missiles or from the airplanes of these territories. But still, it is very interesting how quickly those communities are trying to restore the life to the normal. Because it's like you're trying to, after the flood, you're trying to clean your street immediately, just not to see what's happened. That's the same what people were doing in those communities in Chernihiv or in Kharkiv, in Sumy region. They wanted to clean mentally and physically the leftovers of the Russian occupation. From putting flowers to restoring the buildings that have been bombed as soon as possible, just not to see those consequences. When you go to the east of the country, it is one of the most problematic territories now, because the warfare, the biggest battles like Bakhmut and others, they are happening there. So there it is both physical threat, and this threat is very unstable, because we understand that the front line is more than 1,000 kilometers. You need to understand the territory of Ukraine is huge. So when you speak about one battle, it's not about few kilometers. We're speaking about hundreds of kilometers of the active battlefield. And those territories, it's also the regions like Zaporizhia, where you have the nuclear power plant occupied by the Russian Federation, with stationing their military equipment over there and shelling the neighboring territories just from the territory of the nuclear power plant. So you understand that there they both have physical threat fears, but at the same time, this nuclear threat, the possibility of the facto dirty bomb explosion, because nuclear plants can be as a dirty bomb if some accident happens. So there you have a very difficult emotional situation, definitely not speaking about classical operational. Then we go to the south, and south it is the sea, it is the coastal line. And here you have two different, one part is still occupied by the Russian Federation, the regions of Zaporizhia and Kherson, even that Kherson city been recently liberated. But then you have Odessa. And Odessa is under the attacks from time to time, not that heavy as the north or the east. It's mostly attacks of the drones for the last months. But it is the necessity of the Black Sea ports to operate because they're engaged in the grain deal. Because that is the territory from which not only Ukrainian well-being depends, but or security, but the food security in the world, the African countries, Asian countries that been dependent on Ukrainian grains. That's why here the situation is absolutely different in terms of the dynamics, the threats, the perception of what is happening. Then you have the West, West, some of the regions being under the sporadic attacks against their critical infrastructure. So, for example, yesterday I returned from Lviv, and it's normal not to have 8 hours of electricity during the day. So you have 4 hours without electricity, then 8 hours electricity, 4 hours without electricity. But the city is trying to cope with this as well as the regions, because it's not only the generators became the most popular gift or anything that people are buying, or when you speak about like not buying the new dress, but buying the new warm suit to sit and when you work at home, understanding that next day you can have problems with heating system. So people are trying to build this resilience at the ground level to understand how they can cope with the difficulties, not just to panic about it. And then you have capital, Kiev and some parts of the central Ukraine that are both under the threat, because like just yesterday we had the new attack against the Kiev city. So capital on the one hand is the most protected, but on this another hand definitely under the constant threat from the Russians. But at the same time, life is continuing there. More and more colleagues are returning back to the city. More and more of the public events are being organized. Cafes are opening, and that is the international delegations, the foreign diplomats or leaders of the states are coming almost daily. And that's also important. That's also the demonstration of this resilience of the country, of the population, that Russian Federation will not be able to cancel the daily life and the daily business of the cities. That's why what all of cities share, it is the unpredictability when you don't know what will be after the next attack. And that's making the life quite problematic. And the last in this, you asked about the military. All my friends who are in the different units with whom we stay in contact, yes, they're tired because, I mean, 9 months without rotation in the constant high alert mood, that's very difficult. But at the same time, what we really started to understand how morale and understanding of the goal, why you are there, are important. I mean, in the textbooks, you're the military, you know, you always have these chapters about the soldiers' morale. But in most of the cases, it's something abstract for us. Now, during these 9 months, I really understood the difference between the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces in terms of their performance, in terms of their readiness, in terms of their coordination, in terms of their fighting capabilities, how much morale and understanding why and for what they are fighting are important for the general performance. And they're speaking about this. They said, yes, we're tired, but we understand that society is with us, that society understands for what we stand, and we understand for what we fight for our land. So their motivation is changing completely, and they're ready to continue it even during the holidays without ceasefire, because they understand that ceasefire will be beneficial only for the Russian Federation.
Great, thank you for that. And I kind of wanted to see if you could maybe expand on, you know, where you're talking about the civil society and its sort of resilience and building back. Like I'll say one thing it's been notable to me, both from sort of a military perspective in terms of like, you know, recovery of infrastructure after an attack, because you want to sort of get it back operational to support you. But also from, you know, from my personal life living here, it has been hugely impressive and astounding to watch just how quickly like first responders and the people who have to rebuild the critical infrastructure like power plants have been able to fix things in the midst of a war zone. And I'm thinking back to a winter storm Virginia had it was earlier this year, you know, and we lost power for 5 days. Nobody was shooting missiles at us. It was just took 5 days to get the infrastructure back. And I'm watching what's going on in your country and noting that, you know, power might get knocked out. In some places, it'll get knocked out, like you said, for Odessa for several days as well. But in some places, it's back on either the same day or the next day. And I remember very vividly, there was one kind of before and after picture, I think it was in Kyiv, that there was a missile attack that made this giant crater in a road right? And the next day it was fixed, like patched over, like you wouldn't even notice it was there. Is there special training, or is there something unique about what your first responders and those civil engineers, construction workers have been able to like rebuild and sort of reoperationalize those things so quickly, even though they keep coming under continuous attack?
There are several issues to speak about society. First, your example about the road, if we are in the peaceful time, I would say that it would take it at least 1 month to repair that problems at the road. Usually, it's always the question here that when you need to change the tube, you're changing the tube, but another agency who is in charge of the road cover will come only in 1 month. So in the peaceful time, we will have the situation even worse than what you describe in Virginia. But that is probably also the question of motivation, because here it is the different perception of why it's happened and why we need to repair it. So the emergency services, the first responders, the energy companies, or the post office, they understand what they are doing, that they are part of this general societal resilience, and that they are part of this war, that it's not just something happens that you need to go by the classical protocol of what you're doing, but that is something what is important both for the demonstration to the Russian Federation that they are not able to break us. So here, the motivation really works very, very seriously in pushing people of doing it. Sometimes it also definitely depends on the local authorities who is in charge or of the chiefs of these agencies. So when you have the very highly motivated, young, very interesting person in charge of the post office of Ukraine, you see what they're doing, because he is, as the leader, bringing all his staff doing this with him. He is the first one to come to the newly liberated territories, and the national post is opening probably in a few hours after the liberation, and they're bringing with them pensions, humanitarian aid, everything. So they're trying to be that first picture that people are seeing, not from the commercial point of view, but from the point of view of those services that are needed. The same you see from the railway, how immediately they are starting, because they understand how much of other services will depend if the railway start operating to these newly liberated cities. The energy as well, we understand how much dependent from the electricity, our heating, our water supply, our internet, our communications. So that's why these people are trying to work as much as possible, so not to allow Russians to cut off us, not just from the benefits of the first world, but we understanding the operational necessities of this. But in general, if you speak about the Ukrainian society, there are several issues that we need to understand. Starting from 2014, we had a huge volunteers movement. And at that time, because our armed forces didn't have any proper supply, and the armed forces de facto being destroyed by the Russian agents and the corruption, they were civilians and volunteers who united the efforts, who gathered money, who organized the logistical chains, and been supporting the not only armed forces, but all other security forces on the ground. And then for some years, few last years, because the government already worked in the proper way, they've been supporting just some individual cases. It was not the same scale of this. When the war started again in February, all those people plus additional, because they already had protocols, mechanisms, connections, chains, logistical contacts, providers, they accumulated their efforts, and what they're doing now, it's really unique, the level of their cooperation. For example, you need to imagine that for the first time in history of the world, the civilian charity foundation of one of the Ukrainians received an official license for the direct import of the weapons of any types. So de facto, the arms trade license that in Ukraine is totally governmental controlled, according to the legislation. But because they've been buying all this, they're buying combat drones, they're buying armed vehicles, they are buying just crazy type of the equipment that you even cannot imagine. Another volunteer organization decided to buy 3 drones. combat drones Bayraktar. So each of them approximately $5 million. They said, okay, Ukrainians, let's donate money. We have 1 week and we need 15 million. In 4 days, Ukrainians donated $20 million. So more money in less days. The Bayraktar company became that much fascinated with these that they said that they will gift these 3 drones, and they did it. And they asked to spend for something bigger this money. This charity foundation had negotiations with the Ministry of Defense asking, what is your real needs, what you cannot afford now? In 1 month, they bought satellite for Ukraine. So now Ukraine have the access to the unique satellite system that allows to see, first of all, it's only ours. So we are not dependent from our partners. And you understand that now we have this information in 3 hours, not in 3 days as usually. The second, this type of the satellite allows us to see even with the bad weather. So the capabilities that previously we didn't have. As the Ministry of Defense just reported, the payoff, if you can say, of this purchase, we received in 2 days. So those targets that the Ministry of Defense were able, but the Armed Forces of Ukraine were able to target just in 2 days because of the use of this new satellite, equal for the price of the satellite that Ukrainians bought. And that's definitely what the society is discussing. Like, we bought, it's not charity foundation, but it's we bought the satellite for our armed forces. I gave you only 2 examples of the biggest charities. And now try to imagine that you have thousands of such initiatives. From the individuals, the artist or the writer who is gathering money for the cars for military, to the small charity foundations who are supporting paramedics or some particular units. And that is definitely a national, it's not even campaign, I don't know to say, it became the equal part of the world. So that's of our daily life, that for people to support the security services and armed forces of Ukraine in this big battle is normal. And the same is very often happening at the humanitarian level. Even that there, it is easier to find support from the international community. For many people, it's easier to provide with generators or with the food or something for the communities in need. But at the same time, a lot of these efforts are done on the ground by the Ukrainian NGOs, small grassroots NGOs. We even had statistics that even that the big international organizations, like Red Cross, for example, received 90% of the international financing for the aid in Ukraine, but 90% of the actual work was done by the local NGOs. We are still, it's quite an issue for us where those money spent, because in most of the communities, I see that the real actions are done just by the local civil society.
Great, thank you very much. And I wonder if I don't know if you know the answer to this, but you're talking about the charities and the foundations that have done fundraising for certain things directly, either for the military or security forces. One thing that I've myself and some associates have noted, outside of the country, has been the concerted effort to get not the international NGO donations and outside of official foreign military and civil aid, but to try and extend that that crowdsourcing, if you will, of individual sort of voluntary support, small donation type thing towards organizations inside the country has and so I understand that my perspective is probably a little bit skewed because I follow a lot of these things and they seem very active. What's been the impact of that sort of that non-official individual international support towards those organizations? Has it made a difference? Has it filled in any gaps, or has it been maybe overplayed in the news at all?
Yeah, that's really important, because when we see the amount of the monies that being gathered, they're tremendous. Their initiatives, like for example, St. Javelin, is getting, like, it started from the small stickers, funny stickers that the founder wanted to sell for the small support, and in a few months they gathered more than $1 million. Is it a lot or not? That is huge money, let's be honest, for the small initiative of just one person at that time. What is done by NAFO North Atlantic Fella organization. You have these meme dogs, but they're doing tremendous things, both from spreading information, because sometimes support is not only in money. The more people understand what is happening here, the more they are spreading information, the more they are involved, we are not forgotten. That's definitely demonstrating that there is no fatigue from Ukraine, as everybody is afraid, that one day it can come. So these initiatives and this international support is important both in terms of moral information, because Russians see how united we are, that their propaganda in many of these countries are not working and they would like to see it, but also in terms of finances, because you think that it is just $10 that you spend, but when you have 10,000 of such people, that is already very serious amounts that are involved. When you see the stars like Barbara Streisand giving for Thanksgiving 24,000 for the United 24 campaign, we understand how many other people are following her and looking at this. Or I really like how the astronaut Kelly started the campaign now for the ambulances, for example. And very quickly, because of his name, because of the respect to him, he gathered several $100,000 for the ambulances that Ukraine is needed at the newly liberated territories. So all of these are really getting appreciation from the Ukrainian side, because we always speak here that there is no small aid. You're helping as much as you can. What is the most important? How many of us are ready to help? So it can be really small amounts, but it can have a big impact because you have that big amount of people being involved in this. And just sometimes it is important to understand what initiative you're supporting. And more in Ukraine, we are encouraging foreigners not to donate just for the big organizations, I mean international organizations that spend significant amounts of money for the administration of the projects, for salaries for their Western, for example, managers or something like this, but to spend it for exact project that they are ready to support. The initiative to restore schools in Chernigiv, because in the city of Chernigiv, all schools were bombed in spring, so kids didn't have the possibility to return. That's money. That's small money that you can give, but you understand exactly where. Or we need generators for Kherson. There are projects that doing this. Support this particular project. Just check their reputation. But you can do it. And these people will really appreciate your help, because you will see directly how your money changed the situation. And you always can find these opportunities through different initiatives around Ukraine, what is closer to your heart.
Great, thank you very much. I'd love to keep talking for hours and hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I one more question for you, and then I'm gotten everything that I want to get out there. But I hope it's a question that you can. I assume you'll have a good answer for, and it's, if there's one thing that you would want our audience to know or to think about here, in the coming weeks, especially going into the wintertime, what's one thing you'd like our audience to think about or know about here in the near future as the war continues?
Definitely first thing, start to think about this war as your war. And start to think about this war as the existential war. What we are fighting for is not the territory. We are not fighting for the additional 100 kilometers of our land. Ukraine is huge. It is the biggest country in Europe by territory. What we are fighting for is people. We are fighting for those people, as you saw at CNN or Sky News the first days in Kherson, when people were saying, without electricity or without you, meaning Russia, without you. So for Ukrainians, freedom and dignity are the biggest values historically. That's the thing that we've been fighting for generations, and the things that we've been oppressed by Moscow for centuries. That's why now when we are fighting, when we are liberating people at the occupied territories, it's not because we are fighting to be members of NATO or not. That is fighting for our future, for our sovereignty. That is fighting for the dignity of our people, for the respect of the human rights and democracy. And that is the choice when we're choosing to be members of NATO. We're choosing it not because of the military power of the US or United Kingdom. We're choosing it because we understand the values of this organization. the values of countries that are members there. And that's why Ukraine thinks that now we have something to remind our partners that unfortunately in the 21st century, we still need to fight for these things. We used to think as granted for the things like democracy, human rights, respect to your language, for example, or human being. The Russian Federation demonstrated to us that we still need to fight and to be ready to take the arms to defend this. That's why think about us as the soon members of the club of the NATO, but not because it is the club, but because it is definitely the community of values that we share. And we hope that our partners share as well, understanding why they need to support us.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think that's a good note to end on here. So, like I said, I wish we could talk for hours, but I know we both have other things we need to get on with their days. But to Dr. Hanna Shelest, again, thank you very much for your time and for working with us to schedule this and finding you a place where at least you're safe and you have some electricity, so we're able to do it. On behalf, and definitely we're grateful to Dr. Amin Tarzi, our Director of Middle East Studies, for helping arrange this, and his truly global network of friends and associates has been a huge benefit for us to be able to continue to sort of keep eyes on and keep attention, on what's going on over in Ukraine, and especially be able to tell, the stories firsthand, like your experiences, for the people who live there. Like, this is a daily reality. It's not just a news headline for you. So again, we're very grateful for your time. You and your fellow citizens are definitely in our thoughts, and we're going to continue probably pulling on Dr. Tarzi's network as well as other folks we can get to keep attention on this and share this information, until the war is over. And we hope that you and your fellow citizens and neighbors and friends and family have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as best as you can. And best wishes to you.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.